The line at docking gate 7 had not moved in 20 minutes, and I was already the most interesting thing in the corridor, not interesting in a good way. I could feel their eyes on me from across the terminal. Alien eyes come in all shapes and arrangements and quantities, but they all manage to carry the same thing when they fall on a human who has clearly passed his physical prime. Curiosity first, because humans were still a novelty in hegemony transit hubs, then something else, something that settled into the posture of the observer like a weight being put down gently, a relaxation, a conclusion reached without much deliberation. The thing over there is not a concern. I was 73 years old. My hair had gone gray down to my collar, and the collar was from a shirt I had bought in Aberdeen 7 years ago, because I had liked the way it fit, and had seen no reason to replace it. My hands were scarred along the backs, and thickened at the knuckles in the way that hands get when they have spent a very long time doing difficult things. They moved more slowly than they once had, and they ached when the weather was coming in, and they were still steady when steadiness was what was required. I was standing in an interstellar transit terminal with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a transit pass stamped with the official seal of the Earth Diplomatic Lottery, and I was about to board the hegemony cruiser Velshan for a 4-week transit to the most important diplomatic summit that humanity had been invited to in 30 years. They had sent me, not a trained diplomat with polished credentials and a support team, not a decorated military official in ceremonial dress, not a young face from the Ministry of Interstellar Affairs with a team of advisors and a briefing book the size of a novel. They had sent Elias Koran, retired Sergeant Major, Earth Combined Forces, holder of the Kepler Belt Campaign Medal, the Frontier Defense Cross, and a somewhat less glamorous citation for what my commanding officer had once called stubborn continued presence in situations that ought to have concluded him. Survivor of 3 wars that had never made it into the hegemony historical record, because humanity had not yet had a seat at that table when they happened. Current occupant of a 2-room apartment on the outskirts of Aberdeen, Scotland, where I grew tomatoes on the south windowsill and maintained a feeding arrangement with 8 pigeons that had decided my balcony railing was theirs, and were not interested in my opinion on the matter. My granddaughter Lena had submitted the lottery application without telling me. She had done it on a Sunday afternoon while I was asleep in my chair after dinner, typing my information into the ministry portal on her small device with the confident speed of a 22-year-old who believed that large, unlikely things happened to people who applied for them. When the acceptance letter arrived 4 months later, her scream of excitement woke me from a sound sleep and caused me to knock over my tea, which went across the table and took a newspaper with it. She then filmed me reading the letter and sent the video to 17 of her friends, a choice I accepted with the equanimity of someone who has long since stopped expecting privacy. The Earth government, when they received the notification that their diplomatic representative of their to the Galactic Hegemony Summit had been determined by lottery, and was a retired infantry sergeant major who grew window tomatoes, had held a series of meetings about it. I received a summary of those meetings in my briefing package. The outcome was that they decided not to override the result. The official reasoning, as stated in the documentation, was that sending a civilian lottery winner would demonstrate to the hegemony that humanity had genuine faith in its own democratic processes and its own people. I read that reasoning twice. I thought it was the kind of logic that a person generates when they need to be comfortable with a situation they did not anticipate and cannot change. The more practical explanation, as far as I could determine from reading between the lines of 7 years of failed diplomatic summaries, was that the formal approach had produced nothing of value, and someone somewhere in the ministry had decided that doing something different was worth attempting, even if the something different was sending a retired soldier who fed pigeons. 7 years. 3 formal delegations, expensively assembled and thoroughly prepared. 3 rounds of negotiations that had resulted in polite expressions of mutual respect and no binding agreements whatsoever. So here I was. I stood in the docking line and looked around the terminal at the assembled representatives of 14 species, and I noticed across the corridor the group of Vreth soldiers watching me. The Vreth were hard to miss under any circumstances. They averaged 2.5 meters in height, with frames built on proportions that suggested their ancestors had dealt with nothing smaller than they were for a very long time. Their bodies were covered in overlapping scale plates, each one slightly iridescent, running the color spectrum from deep blue-black in the largest adults to a lighter ocean blue in the younger ones. Along the back of their heads and necks ran the crest, a narrow ridge of highly sensitive bioluminescent tissue that fanned outward when stimulated, and served as a direct readout of their internal state in social situations. The Vreth had evolved in an environment where concealing emotion was neither possible nor advantageous. and the crest made concealment essentially impossible. What they were feeling was visible, in broad strokes, to anyone who knew the basics of what to look for. The crests on the group across the corridor were fully extended and pressed forward, which indicated confidence, social dominance, and the active intention to occupy space. The one at the front, with the most rank insignia on his collar and the bearing of someone who had spent his life being the largest and most capable entity in most of the rooms he entered, was looking at me. He was saying something to the officer beside him in a low voice that was social in character rather than private. He switched to universal, the hegemony common tongue. He said it clearly. He said it loud enough to carry across the corridor without being loud enough to be technically provocative. He said, "They sent us a husk." His officers responded with the Vreth laughter sound, quick and percussive, like gravel in a metal container, short bursts of it, shaped to carry. I looked at him. The looking was the entire response, not aggressive, not flinching, not performing anything, just the level, settled kind of looking that I had spent decades developing in situations where the alternative was showing something that would cost me. The look that had no argument in it and no retreat, because it had nothing it needed to defend and nowhere it needed to go. I held that look for 4 seconds. Something happened in his face that was small and very interesting. The crest feathers dropped a fraction. Not dramatically, not consciously, a fraction. Then he turned back to his companions and continued his conversation. His name was Commander Zilthar. I learned that from the ship's passenger manifest that evening. He had commanded 3 successful territorial campaigns. He had never lost a formal engagement. He was 41 years old by Vreth reckoning, which placed him at the precise peak of his species considered prime. By every measure his culture used to assess worth, he was at the top of the ranking. He had never been afraid of anything in his life. I picked up my duffel bag and walked to the gate. The Velshan was designed for transit efficiency and not for passenger comfort. My cabin was on the lower deck near the engine housings, and the vibration from the drives was constant and noticeable. I did not mind this. I had slept through considerably worse. I had slept in vacuum-rated armor on the surfaces of airless moons while people outside attempted to determine my location. I had slept in medical facilities with monitors connected to various points on my body and alarms, sounding at unpredictable intervals. A vibrating bunk in a small but private cabin was, by the standards of rest I had accumulated over 40 years, practically luxurious. I unpacked my duffel bag, 2 changes of clothes, my personal log device, a photograph of Lena at her graduation, standing in the rain outside the university building, with her academic gown soaked and her expression luminous. A small envelope containing 2 packets of tea from the shop on Granger Street in Aberdeen that stocked the only brand I had ever found genuinely worth drinking. The battered copy of a book I had been attempting to finish for 6 years, which I brought on every journey, and read approximately the same 3 pages of before falling asleep. I placed everything in the small storage compartment, sat on the bunk, and wrote the first entry in my personal log. Day 1 aboard the Velshan. Transit time to summit, 26 days. Passenger complement includes 14 species delegations, 1 Vreth military contingent under Commander Zilthar, and approximately 90 others. The Vreth commander made a public comment about my appearance at the docking gate. His crest feathers reduced their angle by approximately 10% at 4 seconds of sustained eye contact. He looked away first. "This is information." I closed the log, found the mess hall, and ate my first meal of ration paste. 3 minutes into the meal, a small figure sat down across from me. She was Mirai, compact no more than 1.5 meters, with smooth, pale skin and bioluminescent patches along her cheekbones, and the backs of her hands that shifted color with her emotional state in a way the briefing documents had described as involuntary and entirely legible to anyone familiar with the key. Hers were a calm and steady blue-green, which indicated cautious goodwill. She said she was Sela, second attaché to the Mirai cultural delegation, and that she had come to sit with me because what had happened at the docking gate had seemed unfair to her. I told her I appreciated the sentiment and that I had not been bothered by it. She asked if I had been angry. I told her no, I had been curious. She asked what I was curious about. I told her I was curious about the gap between what Commander Zilthar thought he knew about the thing across the corridor and what was actually true. Her bioluminescent patches flickered briefly to amber and then settled back to blue-green. She did not respond to that directly, but she stayed for the rest of the meal. And she talked about her homeworld, which she said was warm and full of rivers that her people sang to for no practical reason whatsoever. And I listened. And it was the best conversation I had had since leaving Aberdeen. On the 3rd day out, there was the incident at the viewport. I had established a morning habit of going to the observation corridor on the port side of the ship, where floor-to-ceiling transparent panels gave an unobstructed view of the star field. I went early, when the corridor was mostly empty, with my cup of not tea and nothing particular to accomplish, and I stood at the glass and let the stars be what they were. That morning the corridor was not empty. Ziltar and 4 of his officers had arrived before me and positioned themselves at the central panels, which gave the widest and clearest view. I entered from the far end and moved toward an open section near the midpoint of the corridor. I had no interest in their space. I was going to where there was room. One of the junior officers shifted sideways as I passed him, casually, just enough to bring his shoulder across my path at the moment I was beside him. I stumbled. My hand caught the wall rail. My cup did not. Ziltar turned. He looked at me and then he crouched. He brought his full height down to my level in a deliberate, performed movement that the Vreth used to indicate that they were lowering themselves to address something beneath their regard. A gesture of contempt framed as consideration. He said, in clear universal, dropping each word with the care of someone who has planned them, "Does the elder human need help walking to his grave?" His officer responded. The Cathan scholars at the far end went very still. 2 Mirai staff members looked at each other and then at the floor. A Dravosi technician froze mid-step. I looked at Ziltar with the same look I had used at the gate. Level, still, without the heat of anger and without the retreat of discomfort. The look that does not argue and does not leave, because it is already precisely where it chose to be. I held it for 4 seconds. His crest feathers dropped again. The same fraction, the same involuntary fraction. He straightened and turned back to the viewport. The conversation, in his assessment, was finished. I had fallen. I had said nothing. The point had been made. I went back to my cabin and made another cup of tea from one of my own packets, the real kind, and drank it slowly, and wrote in my log. The Vreth commander reduced crest angle on sustained eye contact. Second occurrence. The response appears to be below his conscious awareness. He does not know he is doing it. This is significant information about what his biology is registering versus what his conscious mind has concluded. I closed the log and looked at the ceiling for a while. Something I had learned a very long time ago, in the first year of active service, was that the difference between what people thought they were broadcasting and what their bodies were actually communicating was usually where the most useful information lived. Zilthar's conscious mind had concluded that I was a husk, a placeholder, something beneath consideration. His biology was running a different calculation and arriving at a different result, and the result was showing in the involuntary adjustment of a display that was supposed to signal absolute confidence. His biology knew something his pride did not. I was going to let that work its way to the surface on its own schedule. I fell asleep in 4 minutes and slept without any difficulty. Sela came to my cabin on the 5th day with a small recording device held openly in her hand. She showed it to me before she sat down and asked if she might use it. I told her to go ahead. She sat across from me at the small table that took up most of the available floor space in the cabin and set the recording device between us. And she looked at it for a moment as if arranging her thoughts, and then she looked up at me. "I want to ask you about your service," she said. "If that is acceptable." "It is," I said. "How long were you a soldier?" 40 years, I said, roughly. With the time spent in medical facilities counted separately, it comes out to about 36 years of active duty and 4 years of being put back, together in various configurations. Her patches shifted briefly. "You were injured frequently?" "Regularly," I said. I set down my cup and pushed up my left sleeve. The scars on my forearm were old and faded now, pale raised lines running in a rough grid pattern from my wrist to my elbow. They were all that remained visible of a plasma burn I had taken in a tunnel system on the 4th moon of Kepler 7b, during an engagement that lasted 11 hours and begun with 6 people in my squad and ended with 2. The burn had initially covered most of my left arm from wrist to shoulder, and had extended across part of my chest. The medical teams aboard the evacuation transport had worked on me for 16 hours and produced something functional, which was more than I had expected when I went under. What remained now was what could not be erased without more cosmetic intervention than I had ever seen the point of requesting. The scars were part of the record. I kept them. "My granddaughter says I am a walking weather station," I said. "The arm aches when the pressure is changing." Sela looked at my arm for a long time, very still, her patches going to a deep and careful amber. Then she looked up at my face. "Does it hurt now?" "Sometimes," I said. "When the atmospheric systems aboard the ship cycle. When it is going to rain back home. Sometimes for no reason the doctors have been able to identify, which they tell me is a normal consequence of this category of nerve damage, and which I have simply adjusted my expectations around." I pulled my sleeve down. "It is a minor inconvenience. I have had worse inconveniences." She was quiet for a moment, processing something. Then she said, "On my world, there is a tradition regarding people who have been significantly injured in service to their community. When a person has been hurt badly enough that their function is permanently altered, they are moved to a place of care, a sanctuary, comfortable and well-maintained, with people who look after them. It is considered an honor, not a removal. The community acknowledges what the person gave and provides for them in return. She paused. The assumption is that the injury has ended their active contribution. That what they can offer now is different from what they offered before. I nodded. I know that model. Many species have versions of it, but not humans? Not entirely, I said. We care for our injured and our old. We do not abandon them to manage alone. But we have a different understanding of what a person continues to be after long service, what they continue to be worth. I picked up my cup. A soldier who has spent 40 years in active service is not a degraded version of what she was at 25. She is something entirely different from what she was at 25, and the difference is not a reduction. It is an accumulation. I looked at the small porthole in the cabin wall, through which the starfield was a narrow strip of light. Every difficult situation she survived is now part of what she knows, not in a general sense. Specifically, the details, the texture, what it felt like and what the options were and which ones worked and which ones failed and why. What the difference between someone who was going to make it and someone who was not looked like from the inside in the first 30 seconds of a bad situation. What the right decision feels like when you are making it under conditions where you cannot see clearly and your hands are not entirely cooperating. I looked back at Sela. None of that is in a training manual. It cannot be transmitted through documentation. It has to be passed from the person who carries it to the person who needs to learn it, through time and conversation and shared presence. If you put that person in a sanctuary and send someone young to do their job, you have not replaced them. You have lost them. You have traded all of that accumulated specific knowledge for someone who has energy and speed and zero equivalent experience, and in situations where experience is what decides the outcome, that is a very expensive trade. Sela was very still. The patches on her cheeks had gone to a gold so deep it was almost amber, and they were not flickering. So the Earth government sent you, she said carefully, because of what 40 years of difficult situations made you. Partly, I said, but also because of something more specific than that. Something that happens after long enough. I set down my cup. When you have been frightened enough times, and when the fear has not changed the outcome on enough occasions, something in your nervous system recalibrates. The alarm signals stop being the primary thing. They become background noise. What comes to the front instead is the clear part. The part that assesses and decides and acts without waiting for the fear to finish doing what it is doing. I paused. I am not saying the fear goes away entirely. I am saying it moves to a different position, behind the thinking, rather than in front of it. And what that means, practically, is that rooms like this one cannot make me flinch. Sela looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "The rest of the delegations believe you are a mistake, a bureaucratic accident. They think humanity sent you because no one else was available, or because no one with real capability was willing to make the trip." "I know," I said. "Does that concern you at all?" I thought about the tunnel on Kepler 7b, about Owen Harris, who had been the best young soldier I had ever worked with. Sharp and capable, and entirely without fear in the way that 28-year-olds are. Without fear when they have not yet encountered the thing that instructs them otherwise. About the sound his voice made when the suit seals began to go, and he understood what was happening. And about the way I had held the position, and kept my hands steady and done the arithmetic, and waited for the signal, because the signal was what everything depended on. And about what it had cost me to be that steady in that moment, and what it had cost him that I succeeded. About the 31-year-old version of me that had walked into that tunnel with shaking hands and come out the other side with 2 surviving members of a 6-person squad and a knowledge of what I was capable of that I had not possessed going in. "No," I said. "It does not concern me. Being underestimated is a starting condition, not a conclusion." She turned off the recorder. Then she turned it back on. "One more question," she said. "What did you actually think when Commander Ziltar spoke to you at the viewport yesterday?" I looked at the wall for a moment. "I thought," I said, "that he has never been hunted, and I thought about what that means." She waited. "The Vreth are predators," I said. "True apex predators, evolved from the top of their food chain and never displaced from it. 41 years of Ziltar's personal record. Millions of years of species history before that, all at the top." I looked at my hands. They have won everything they have entered. They have never had to face the question that changes a species permanently. "What question?" I was quiet for a moment, putting it together carefully. "The moment," I said, "when the thing looking at you does not see a rival, does not see a competitor, does not see an enemy or an obstacle or a challenge. It looks at you and it sees food. And you have to figure out in that moment, with everything you are and everything you have available to you, how to not be food. Not by being stronger, not by being faster, by being something the predator has no framework for, something new." I paused. "The Vreth have never had that moment. They have been the predator in that equation. They have never had to become something that the thing in the dark did not know how to process, and that absence leaves a specific kind of blind spot. C's had settled to a very still, very deep gold. She was not recording anymore in any noticeable way. She was simply listening. What kind of blind spot, she asked. The kind, I said, that does not know what it does not know. Zilder looked at me at the gate and he saw the biological data. Old, slow, fragile. Below the threat threshold by every measure his instincts have been calibrated to use. And his instincts are good. They are excellent, actually, for the kind of threats they were built to assess. I looked at the narrow strip of stars through the porthole, but I am not a threat his instincts were built to assess. I am the product of something his species never had to survive, and that something is not visible in my physical dimensions or my reaction speed or my bone density. It is in something else, something older and quieter and considerably harder to measure. I turned back to her. His biology is picking it up, even though his mind has not. That is why his crest feathers are dropping every time he looks at me. He does not know why he is doing it. But his biology does. Scylla looked at me for a very long time. What is it picking up, she said. The shape of something, I said, that his species has not encountered before. The shape of a thing that was made by 10,000 years of learning to survive things that should have ended it. That shape has a specific quality, a specific. It is not aggression. It is not power. It is something more fundamental than either of those. I picked up my cup. It is the quality of something that decided it was not going to stop, not because of courage exactly, more because it found something inside itself that was harder than the thing trying to end it, and it has been carrying that hardness forward ever since. Scylla left at midday. At the door she paused and looked back at me. My senior official believes that nothing significant will come of this summit for humanity, she said. She filed that assessment before we departed. She thought it was kind to tell me so that I would not be disappointed. What do you think? I asked. She looked at me for a moment with those wide, pale eyes, and her patches shifted to the quiet amber of someone who has decided something but has not yet said it. I think, she said, that your senior official might need to update her assessment. She closed the door behind her. That afternoon, Zilthar made his formal challenge. He arrived in the common corridor with 2 officers, which among the Vreth indicated an official interaction. He stopped in front of me, extended his crest to full display, and formally invited me to participate in the Tavrith. I knew about the Tavrith from the briefing documents, a physical dominance ritual, non-violent by Vreth standards, used to establish relative rank in shared social spaces, first to step outside the marked boundary conceded position. The briefing had noted in a small print footnote that declining was culturally equivalent to acknowledging lower rank. I declined. Zilthar said that declining was an acknowledgement of lower position. I said that was a Vreth framework and I was not Vreth, and that I did not participate in competitions designed by species that had never had to wonder whether they would survive the next conflict. The corridor went quiet. Ziltar's crest pressed forward for 3 seconds. Then the angle reduced, the same involuntary fraction, the 3rd time in 5 days. You are confident, he said, and his tone had in it something that had not been there before, something that was trying to determine what category of confidence it was encountering. No, I said, I am accurate. Those are not the same thing. I walked past him to the mess hall. That evening I opened the full Vreth military record from the diplomatic files and read it in its entirety for the 2nd time. 41 years of expansion, 8 species brought under Vreth political structure, all by force, none by negotiation. 0 conflicts in which the Vreth had entered as the smaller party. 0 engagements where the Vreth had faced a genuine possibility of species-level consequence. Every single war they had fought, they had chosen the timing of. They had been the party that decided when to begin. They had never been the party scrambling to find an answer that did not yet exist. I closed the file and wrote in my log. The problem with never being hunted is that you do not know what you are made of, because you have never been required to find out. The Vreth are formidable. They are genuinely, impressively formidable, and they have no idea that formidable and indestructible are 2 entirely different categories, because they have never been required to discover the difference. I folded the device away and looked at the ceiling. In 2 days, Zilthar would stand up in the summit dining hall and say what he had been building towards saying since the docking gate. He would make his case that humanity's lottery winner delegate was evidence of humanity's irrelevance, and I would stand up, and I would say the thing that needed to be said, not to win an argument, not out of pride, because it was true, and because it needed to be in the room, and because I had stopped being the kind of person who let things that needed to be said go unsaid because the room was uncomfortable. I slept well. I almost always slept well. The engine hum was becoming familiar like weather. The summit dining hall held everyone aboard with room remaining. The ceiling was a full dome of transparent panels, and above it the stars moved in their slow arc as the Velshan continued its transit toward the hegemony's central cluster. The tables were arranged in a broad, irregular circle, each species delegation grouped together, the arrangement suggesting community without enforcing proximity. The empty floor at the center served as an informal speaking area that no one had claimed yet. The first 2 dinner sessions had been polite and deliberate and almost entirely without substance. Delegations introduced themselves and their intentions. Junior officials exchanged contact information and assessed one another with the careful attention of people who were building dossiers in their heads. I sat at my table and ate what was served and listened to everything and said, very little, and I watched the room do what rooms do before they reveal what they actually are. On the 3rd evening, Commander Ziltar stood up. He did not request the floor. The Vreth did not make requests in social situations. He rose from his seat and his crest feathers extended to their full display. And the room responded to that stimulus the way a room responds to a large confident predator standing up in its center. Conversation stilled, attention gathered. The space around him cleared without anyone consciously deciding to clear it. I wish to address the assembled delegations on the matter of representation, he said. His universal was excellent. He had the kind of fluency that comes from having used a language for diplomatic advantage over a long period of time, where the words arrive with the precise weight and timing that serves the speaker's purpose. He turned slowly, and his gaze moved around the room, and it stopped on me. Every species at this table has sent representatives appropriate to the significance of this gathering, he said. Experienced diplomats, accomplished officials, people whose presence signals that their governments understand what this summit is and what it means. He held the pause. Humanity has sent this. The 2 words dropped into the room and spread outward. I do not offer this as an insult, he continued, and his voice was measured and almost generous. The tone of a teacher explaining an obvious thing to a student who perhaps is sure struggle to see it. I offer it as an observation and as a reading of the message that the observation carries. Humanity has sent one individual, an individual who is, by every biological measure, past the active period of his service, elderly, physically diminished, a participant in a lottery, not a selection by merit or capability. He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable acknowledgement. We may understand this as communication. Humanity sends us this representative because humanity understands its own position in this gathering. It is not a position of strength or equality. It is a position of acknowledgement that they have not yet earned a seat at this table, as genuine partners. They send a symbol rather than a substance, a gesture toward participation rather than actual participation. He let that settle. We may respect the gesture. We need not mistake it for more than it is. He sat down. His officers produced the gravel rolling sound in careful, socially calibrated bursts. Around the room, delegations shifted. Several looked at me and then at other things. The Khan archivist had all 7 eyes arranged in the spread formation that indicated active processing. The Dravosi technical observer had stepped slightly closer from the outer edge of the room. Sela at the Marae table 3 positions from mine had her recording device active in her hand. Her patches were the deep, still blue of complete attentions. I put down my fork. I stood up. I stood the way I had learned to stand, without hurry, without performance, without announcing anything. I simply rose to my full height, which was not remarkable in any room and was particularly unremarkable in this one. And I looked across at Ziltar, and then I took a slow look around the room at everyone present, and then I spoke. My voice was quiet. It had been quiet for most of my adult life, in the way that voices go quiet when they no longer need volume to get the result they are seeking. Quiet voices, at the right moment, pull rooms toward them rather than pushing the room away. And the room I was in leaned inward now as though something had altered the air. Commander Zilthar, I said. Thank you for your words. He had not expected that. I could see the small adjustment it produced in his expression. The prepared counter was ready for defensiveness or anger or formal diplomatic objection. Courtesy was not what he had braced for. You may be predators, I said. I let that land. I gave it 3 full seconds of silence, which is a long time in a quiet room. I mean that without any trace of irony, I said. The Vreth are genuinely extraordinary. Your species is one of the most impressive examples of predatory evolution in the hegemony record. Your physical architecture is remarkable. Your military coordination is something that other species spend careers studying and still cannot fully replicate. Your crest displays alone represent a sophistication of social communication that most species cannot match with their entire vocal and gestural repertoire combined. Your 41-year record of successful territorial expansion is not luck. It is the product of real capability, real discipline, and genuine strategic intelligence. I paused. I respect all of that. I want to be clear that I respect it because I have read your record carefully, and it is genuinely worthy of respect. What I am about to say is not an attack on the Vreth. It is an addition to what this room knows about humanity. Zilthar's crest feathers had shifted from the full forward display. They were still extended, but the angle had changed. The confident forward press of social dominance had moved towards something more lateral, more attentive. The display of something listening rather than something asserting. The room was entirely silent. Humans did not begin as predators, I said. I want that stated plainly and understood clearly. At our biological origin, we were not the apex of anything. We were small, slow by comparison to the things that hunted us, fragile in ways that most species in this room are not. Our young were helpless for years before they could function independently, which is an extraordinary vulnerability for any species sharing a world with things that are faster and stronger, and built specifically for the task of hunting. We had no natural armor, no natural venom. Our teeth in our hands, compared to what we shared our world with, were the tools of an animal that was supposed to be a meal, not a hunter. I looked around the room. Every pair of eyes, in whatever configuration their species used for eyes, was on me. The Catan archivist had stopped moving completely. The Dravosi technical observer had her optical implants fully open. 3 minor delegation representatives who had been speaking quietly to each other when Zilthar stood up were now entirely motionless. And the things that wanted us, I said, were considerably larger, faster, better designed for what we're doing. We were on the hunting list of multiple apex predators simultaneously, and for a significant stretch of our early history as a species, the question of whether humans would continue to exist was genuinely undecided. The arithmetic was not in our favor. I took a slow breath. So we faced the defining moment, I said, the moment that defines species, not individuals. The moment when the numbers say that continuation should not be possible, and something has to change, and the change has to come from inside because there is nothing outside to help. The moment when you look at what you have available, and what you are up against, and you have to find an answer that does not exist yet. I looked at the room. Some species answer that moment with physical adaptation, armor, venom, speed, reproductive rates so high that losses do not threaten the whole. Humans had none of those available in the timescales that mattered. We had something else. We had the beginning of the ability to think across time in a way that our predators could not. I looked at Zilthar. We remembered, I said, not just individually, collectively. We developed the ability to pass information between individuals and across generations in a way that preserved it, that kept the lesson of a grandfather's failed hunt alive and available to his granddaughter without her having to fail the same hunt herself. We began to cooperate not in the small groups that our biology suggested, but in numbers large enough to be collectively dangerous to things that could destroy any one of us. We made tools, we controlled fire, we gradually, over thousands of years, developed ways to extend our capability far past what our bodies could do alone. And we did all of this, not because we were ambitious, or because we were particularly extraordinary in our beginning. We did it because the alternative to developing it was ending. I let that sit in the room. We spent 10,000 years, I said, learning how to make predators afraid of the dark, not by becoming faster or stronger, by becoming something new. Something that the predators had never encountered in the form we eventually took. Something that planned not just for the threat in front of it, but for threats that had not arrived yet. Something that learned from every failure and encoded the lesson and passed it forward and tried again. Something that did not stop. I paused, and eventually the things that had once looked at us and seen food looked around, and found that we had become the thing in the dark that they did not want to follow. The silence in the room had a texture now. It was not the silence of boredom or inattention. It was the silence of a room that is processing something at a level deeper than conversation. You may be predators, I said, but predators have a specific and limited relationship with the thing I have just described. Predators succeed because they are the most capable thing in a given ecosystem. They have never had to become something that the most capable thing in the ecosystem could not account for. They have never been pressed against the question of what to do when being the most capable version of what they are is not enough. I kept my voice even. The Vreth have been predators since before your written history. You have never faced the question that changes a species permanently. You have never had to decide as a people what you were willing to become in order to still exist, and that absence leaves a specific shape in what you are, a gap where a particular kind of hardness should be, not a flaw, not a weakness exactly, an absence, a thing you were simply never required to develop because your situation never required it. I looked at the room one more time. Humanity did not send me here as a token, I said. They sent me because I am what happens after 40 years of difficult situations have finished, with a person. After 40 years of being in places where the wrong decision had immediate and irreversible consequences, and making the right decision anyway, and coming back out on the other side, and doing it again. I am what the process of surviving things that should have ended you produces. When you survive enough of them, I am not an impressive physical specimen. I am not the fastest or the strongest person in this room. I am the person in this room who has the fewest remaining things that are capable of surprising him into making a bad decision. And that is what humanity sent to this summit. Not a symbol, not a courtesy gesture, not an admission that we know our place. I sat back down and picked up my fork. A message. The message is that humanity is not afraid of this room. We have been in worse rooms. We have been in rooms that were on fire and depressurizing and full of things that wanted us to stop existing. And we came out of those rooms still standing. And we are standing here now. Think carefully about what that means. I ate the rest of my meal in a room that did not find its full noise level again for a very long time. Ziltar did not speak again that evening. His crest feathers were flat, not the fraction I had seen before. Not the involuntary small reduction of something registered below conscious awareness, flat. Against his back and neck the way a flag goes when the wind has stopped entirely. I saw his officers look at him with something I could not fully read in Vreth expression, but which had in it an element that I thought was confusion. They had not seen this before. Their commanding officer's crest, which had been fully extended and forward pressed for most of the transit, was now flat, and he had not chosen to make it flat. His biology had made that choice without consulting him. Seela's recording device was still running. The Khan archivist was very still. The Dravosi technical observer's optical implants had made 3 separate focus adjustments in the 30 seconds after I sat down. I finished my ration paste and drank the last of the not tea and sat for a while as the room slowly recovered around me. And then I went back to my cabin. In my personal log I wrote, "Today the room changed, not because of an argument, not because of a demonstration of power, because something true was said in it, and the truth had a specific shape, and some of the biology in that room recognized the shape before the minds attached to that biology knew what they were recognizing." I closed the log. I looked at the photograph of Lena on the storage shelf for a while. Then I slept. I lay in my bunk and thought about Ziltar's feathers going flat. Not troubled thinking. Not the anxious kind of late-night reviewing that I had long since trained out of myself. The clear, methodical kind. The kind where the mind takes something significant and turns it over from every angle, not to resolve anxiety about it but to understand it correctly. The crest drop had been involuntary. That was the thing I kept returning to. Among the Vreth, crest position was as controlled as posture in a formal human military context. Officers maintained their display with the same discipline that a human officer maintained their bearing. A crest that moved in unintended ways in a public setting was the equivalent of a senior officer's hands shaking at the podium. It was visible, it was significant, and among people who understood Vreth body language, it was immediately legible. Ziltar's crest had gone flat in front of 60 witnesses. Not all 60 would have recognized what they were seeing, but the Vreth officers present certainly had, and several of the other delegations whose briefing materials covered Vreth body language in any detail would have as well. And Ziltar had not chosen it. That was the point. His pride would never have chosen it. His pride had been telling him, since the docking gate, that I was beneath consideration. His pride had announced that publicly to a room full of witnesses and committed itself to that position with the full authority of his rank and his record. His biology had disagreed, and in the end, when what I said reached whatever level of processing sat below the conscious mind, his biology had expressed its disagreement in the only way that biology has available to it. The involuntary response, the one that happens before the thinking has a chance to manage it. I kept thinking about why. I was not physically threatening. That point was so clear that it barely warranted analysis. Ziltar's physical threat detectors had correctly assessed me as non-threatening and had not generated that response. What I had triggered was something different, something in a different category. The crest drop in Vreth signaling had a specific set of triggers. It appeared in the presence of things that were genuinely dangerous in ways that went beyond simple physical confrontation. Historically, according to the notes in the diplomatic briefing, it had appeared in the early Vreth records, in the context of their encounters with other species that had, in their planetary history, proven capable of ending Vreth lives in ways that Vreth physical superiority alone had not been sufficient to prevent. Not just strong things, not just fast things, things that were smart in a specific way, things that could find angles that the Vreth's predatory instincts did not account for. Things that had, in their own history, done something similar to what I had described. Things that had been pressed against the edge of their survival and had found their way back, and in finding their way back had become something that predator biology, operating on its ancient programming, correctly classified as not safe to depict. His biology had felt the shape of that in what I had described. It had run its ancient and very accurate assessment, and had come to a conclusion that his 41 years of personal victories had never required it to consider before. The thing across the table had survived something that should have ended it, multiple times, for thousands of years, and it was still here, and it was still looking at him, and his crest was down before he knew it was going down. I thought about that for a while, and then I turned off the light and looked at the ceiling in the dark, and thought about what it meant to be 73 years old, and still the most unexpected thing in most rooms you entered. That was not a comfortable thought exactly, but it was an honest one. In the morning, 3 people came to my door. The first was the Khan archivist from the 7th cloister, whose name was a sound I could not produce with a human vocal arrangement, and who had told me at the start of the transit to use a reference number, instead if I needed to address him directly. He arrived at my door before the first meal shift with 6 limbs precisely folded at his body and 7 eyes arranged in the professional interest formation, and asked if I would consent to a recorded conversation for the cloister archives. I asked what specifically he was interested in. He said he had been monitoring the situation aboard the Velshan since departure, and that my statement in the dining hall had raised questions that the existing hegemony archival record on humanity could not resolve. He said that the record contained substantial data on human military capacity and diplomatic history and biological parameters, but that it contained almost nothing on the specific experiential quality of what it was to be human over the course of a long and difficult service. Life. The texture of the thing, he said, using universal phrasing that was slightly unusual, as if he had been reaching for a word from his own language and found the closest available approximation. I told him I was not an academic. I told him the Earth's scientific and historical record would give him more accurate data than my personal account. He said that accuracy was not the primary concern. The cloister was interested in accounts from the inside of human experience, because accounts from the inside were what the archive had identified as missing. He said they had excellent data about what humans did. They had almost no data about what it felt like to be a human doing it. I told him to come back at midday. The second knock came from the Dravosi technical observer. She stood in my doorway and studied me with her adjustable optical implants for about 15 seconds before speaking. Your threat assessment profile is anomalous, she said. You mentioned that before, I said. After the viewport incident, the anomaly has increased, she said. Following your statement last evening, our modeling systems have rerun the assessment parameters multiple times. The physical threat indicators remain in the lowest quartile for this passenger population. The systemic threat classification has moved to the 96th percentile. She paused, and the optical implants refocused. The variance is not resolvable within our current modeling framework. The 2 values should not be able to coexist in a single subject under standard assessment protocols. What does your framework do with data that does not fit its protocols? I asked. Flags the subject for continued observation, she said. All right, I said. She left. The third knock was the one I found most interesting. Velerth Ziltar's second officer stood in my doorway alone. No escort, no formal elements. His crest feathers were held in the low, close position that in Vreth body language indicated attentive study rather than display. He had fewer decorations on his collar than his commander, and his crest feathers had not yet reached full adult growth, which suggested he was younger than the 41 years of Ziltar. He was studying me with the focused, thorough attention of someone who has been asked to resolve a problem by examining its components. He said nothing for approximately 40 seconds. Then he nodded, once, in the human manner, a clean, deliberate dip of the head. This was so unexpected that I had to take a moment to register it. The Vreth had their own forms of acknowledgement and formal agreement, none of which included head nodding. Velerth had adopted a gesture from a species he had met approximately a week ago and used it with the specificity of someone who understood what it meant. He turned and walked away. He said nothing. I made my tea from the second of my 2 personal packets, the real kind, and stood at the porthole with it, and thought about that nod for a long time. At midday, the Cathan archivist returned, and we talked for 2 hours. I told him things I had not spoken about in a long time. I told him about the Kepler 7b tunnel engagement, about Owen Harris and the other 4 who did not come back out, about the 31-year-old version of me, who had gone in with shaking hands and come out the other side, with a knowledge of what he could do that he had not possessed before, and a loss that he had been carrying in a specific and quiet way ever since, about the 7 other engagements over 40 years that had each taken something and left something in its place, about the slow, cumulative process by which a person becomes a different thing from what they started as, not through intention but through the repeated application of extreme circumstances to a human nervous system over a very long period. The Cathan archivist listened with all 7 eyes focused, and his recording device running, and his 6 limbs very still. He asked questions that were precise and thoughtful, and that demonstrated he had done substantial reading before coming to my door. He asked what the subjective experience of fear was like, and whether the absence of active fear I had described meant the absence of all fear, or only a reconfiguration of it. He asked how human memory preserved difficult experiences and whether the preservation changed the experience over time. He asked what I thought of Zilthar. I told him I thought Zilthar was exactly what he appeared to be: formidable, capable, disciplined, and operating with a specific and important gap in his understanding of what he was encountering. I told him I did not think that gap made Zilthar a lesser person. I thought it made him a person who had not yet had the experience that would close it. I told him that the experience that closed that gap was not a comfortable one, and that I was not certain I wished it on him, but that encountering something that could prompt the consideration of it was probably valuable. The archivist thanked me with a formal multi-limb gesture of genuine gratitude. Sella came in the late afternoon, alone, without her recording device. She sat across from me at the small table and said that 3 minor delegations had formally requested to be notified in advance of any future public statements I intended to make, so that they could ensure their full teams were present. I said I had not planned any further public statements. She said she thought that was probably wise and that the one I had made was sufficient for the time being, in that it had introduced a concept that the room was going to need some time to process fully before any additional concept was useful. I asked what concept she thought the room was processing. She said she thought the room was processing the concept of a species that was not impressive by the standard metrics of impressiveness, but that had made itself genuinely difficult to end through a completely different set of means. She said that most species at the hegemony level of development had arrived there through some combination of physical superiority, technological advancement, and political consolidation, and that they assessed other species through those lenses. She said that humanity's arrival at the same level, through a process that involved none of those, as the primary driver, was producing a particular kind of cognitive difficulty in the delegations that were thinking carefully about it. I said I had not thought of it in quite those terms, but that she might be right. She looked at me for a moment with her wide, pale eyes. Velerth asked me today, she said, what the maximum age of active service was for human soldiers in roles similar to yours. I told him it varied considerably by individual and by role, and that there was no fixed upper limit that I was aware of. That is accurate, I said. He also asked, she said, whether the specific quality you demonstrated last evening was something that could be developed through deliberate training, or whether it was exclusively a product of lived experience over time. I thought about that. What did you tell him? I told him I did not know, she said, and then I told him that I thought the question itself was significant, that the fact that he was asking it meant he had identified something worth trying to understand, and I thought that was probably the most important thing that had happened at this summit so far. She left before dinner. That evening, Zilthar found me in the observation corridor. He came alone, with none of the officers or formal elements that had accompanied every previous interaction. He wore his standard uniform, nothing additional, no ceremony to the approach. He stopped beside me at the glass and looked out at the stars, and I looked out at the stars, and we stood there together for almost 3 minutes without speaking. Then he said, in the quieter voice I had heard from him at the viewport 3 days ago, but different from that voice too, more direct, less performed. My second officer has been asking questions about you, about humans, about what you described in the dining hall. I know, I said. Sella mentioned it. He is young, Zilthar said. He has not been tested the way I have. He does not have the record that tells him what to conclude about things he encounters. A pause. He does not have conclusions about you. He is still forming questions. That is often the more useful position, I said. Zilthar looked at me for a moment from the side. You would say that. I would, I said. Because I have seen what happens when people arrive at conclusions too quickly and then encounter something that does not fit the conclusion. The conclusion usually survives longer than it should, because changing a conclusion requires admitting it was wrong, and admitting it was wrong costs something. And you? He said. What did you conclude about the Vreth when you first encountered us? I thought about that honestly. That you are formidable, and that your confidence is earned, and that you have a specific and important gap in your experience of the universe that you are not aware of. I paused. I concluded that about the Vreth as a species. About you personally, I concluded that you are intelligent, which I could see from your tactical record, and that your intelligence had not yet been applied to this particular problem, because the problem had not previously presented itself to you. He was quiet for a moment. What problem? The problem, I said, of encountering something that does not fit the framework you have used successfully for 41 years. Another long silence. Outside the glass, The stars continued their ancient movement. How many wars has humanity fought, he asked. I told him the full number. Not just the interstellar conflicts. All of them. The ones on our own surface before we had any awareness of what lay beyond our sky. The ones fought over borders and beliefs and resources and the fundamental human difficulty of agreeing on how to share a world that felt both enormous and impossibly small depending on who was running out of something. Every one of them. He was quiet for a long time after that. How many did you win? He said. Enough, I said, to still be having this conversation. He made the sound again. The short, low sound without the performance in it. The thing I had come to think of as his unguarded voice making an unguarded sound. My species has never lost a war, he said. It was not a boast. It was something more complicated than a boast. It sounded, in the quiet of the observation corridor with the stars moving past, like a statement that he was looking at from the outside, for the first time, and was not entirely certain what it meant. I know, I said. You said, in the dining hall, that never losing a war meant something was missing. He said, that there was an absence, a gap. I said that never having been hunted left an absence, I said. Never having lost a war is a consequence of that absence, not the absence itself. The absence is the experience of being the smaller party, the desperate party, that has to find an answer that should not be possible because the alternative is ending. He looked at the stars. And you believe that experience produces something that cannot be produced any other way. I know it does, I said. I am the product of a version of that experience, not the species version, the individual version, over 40 years. And I am standing here in this corridor looking at you. And your biology registered a threat response to me that your mind did not authorize. That response came from something that knew the difference between what you concluded about me and what I actually am. I looked at him. Your biology ran the correct calculation. The gap between what your mind concluded and what your biology knew is exactly the absence I was describing. He did not respond immediately. He looked at the stars for a while. Then he said, quietly and formally, the traditional phrase in the old Vreth warrior register. You would have been worth fighting. I accepted it. Thank you, Commander. He walked back down the corridor, and I stood at the glass alone for a while. And the stars moved. And I thought about Owen Harris, and about Lena, and about the pigeons that would be waiting on my balcony railing in Aberdeen. I thought about the document in my duffel bag that I had not yet filed. I thought about what Velrith's nod had meant, and what it had cost him to produce it, and what it suggested about the direction he was going. And then I went to bed, and I slept without difficulty, and in my log that night I wrote only one line. The right conversations are beginning to happen. The rest will follow. The summit lasted 3 full days. I attended every session from the first opening address to the final procedural close. I sat at the table assigned to humanity, which was a small table because humanity had a small presence, and I listened to everything that was said, and I assessed, and I made notes in my personal log, and I spoke when I was directly addressed and not otherwise. I did not make any further public statements. I did not position myself for additional visibility. I simply existed in that room, with the full weight of what I was and what the long process of becoming me had made me, and I let that do the work it was doing without trying to manage or accelerate it. Rooms have a weight. That is something I had learned in 40 years of being in all kinds of rooms, from briefing tents on hostile moons to hospital wards to military tribunals, to the quiet offices where the people who sent others into dangerous places did their thinking. Rooms have a weight that comes from the combined understanding of all the people in them, and when the understanding shifts, the weight shifts, and the conversations that the room produces shift in response. You can change what happens in a room not by controlling the conversations directly, but by changing what the room understands about what it is dealing with. The room's understanding of what it was dealing with, where humanity was concerned, had changed. I could feel it in the small adjustments of posture and attention throughout the 3 days, in the way the Cathan archivist asked questions that assumed more than his previous questions had, in the way 2 of the minor delegation representatives, whose names I had learned by then, and whose governments represented species I had known almost nothing about before the transit, began positioning their own contributions in relation to what humanity represented, rather than what Vreth represented, in the way the Dravosi Technical Observer filed formal reports every 6 hours that I was told, through Sela's informal intelligence network among the lower-level diplomatic staff, consistently used the phrase anomalous subject in their assessment notation, in the way Velrith watched me across the dining hall at every meal without pretending he was not watching. On the afternoon of the final day, a hegemony clerk of Accords, named something I will not attempt to reproduce, came and sat across from me at the human delegation table and placed a flat document between us and said, in the entirely routine tone of someone completing a standard administrative procedure that was no different from the hundreds of other administrative procedures they completed every week, that the Hegemony Interspecies Commerce Directorate had approved humanity's application for full trade partner status under Article 7 of the Hegemony Commercial Framework effective upon signature of both parties. 7 years, 3 formal diplomatic delegations, expensively assembled, thoroughly briefed. Professionally capable people who had done everything that could reasonably be done, and had still come back with nothing binding. 1 lottery winner with a duffel bag and a personal supply of good tea. I signed the document. The clerk signed their portion and took their copy and stood and went to process the next item on their list. I looked at my copy for a moment. The Hegemony seal was printed in the upper right corner, and below it were the technical specifications of what had just been agreed, and below those were 2 signatures, mine and the clerk's, on a dotted line each. I folded the document and put it in my bag. I felt no particular drama about it. That was something that happened after long enough. The significant outcome stopped feeling like climaxes, and started feeling like the correct completion of a process that had been running and had now concluded. The relief was real and the satisfaction was real, but they arrived quietly, the way good news arrives when you have been doing the work long enough that you are more surprised when the work does not produce results than when it does. I went outside the session hall and stood in the corridor and looked at the architecture of the Hegemony Central Station, which was enormous and intricate and designed to signal permanence in every line. And I thought about Lena and about what I was going to tell her when I landed. Sella found me there. She came from the direction of the Mirai delegation suite, moving quickly in the way she moved when something had happened that she wanted to respond to before the moment passed. She stopped in front of me and she pressed her forehead to the back of my hand and held it there for a moment. I knew what it was. The Mirai farewell gesture. The one reserved for individuals who had altered something in a way that was not reversible. The trade corridor, she said when she stepped back. Her patches were the rose color I had only seen once before, the one I had concluded she did not show often. My government's trade corridor through human space. 6 years of failure. I expect that conversation will go differently now, I said. Because of what happened in this summit. Because the room has a different weight now, I said. Conversations that happen in rooms with a different weight tend to produce different results. I did not negotiate for the Mirai. I changed what the room understood about humanity. Those are different things. She looked at me for a moment. My senior official filed a formal assessment before departure saying nothing significant would come of this summit for humanity or its partners. She is already in the process of revising that assessment. Good, I said. Accurate records matter. Sella smiled. The rose color deepened briefly and then settled. Will you come back to the next summit? Ask me in 2 years, I said. My granddaughter may have made different arrangements for me by then. She has opinions about my schedule. She laughed. I was glad to hear it again. She walked back toward her delegation suite, and I picked up my bag and went to find the docking airlock. The Vreth Honor Guard was assembled in the corridor before the airlock. 2 lines, 3 officers each, all in full formal uniform. Ziltar at the head of the first line, his crest in the precise arrangement of the official honor display. I walked between the lines. All 6 officers came to the full formal military attention posture as I passed. The one the Vreth used for their own highest-ranking generals. The one that said, in the clearest possible language of Vreth military tradition, that the thing being acknowledged had demonstrated something, that the Vreth military tradition considered genuinely worthy of acknowledgement. At the airlock I paused and looked back. Ziltar was watching me. His 4 amber eyes were steady and direct and held mine without the layers of assessment and dismissal and recalibration I had watched move through them over the preceding weeks. What was in them now was simpler than any of that. I nodded once. He maintained the formal posture and held my gaze, and behind his eyes was the thing that I had been waiting to see from the moment he called me a husk at the docking gate. Not fear. Not exactly. Something adjacent to respect that only exists in the eyes of something that has been built for dominance, and has encountered a thing it does not have a proper category for. Something that registers as neither threat nor rival nor subordinate, but as a different kind of presence entirely. The presence of something that has been through fires he has not been through, and come out still standing, and which carries the shape of those fires in the way it occupies a room. I went through the airlock. The transit shuttle was smaller than the Velshan, and quieter, with better ventilation and slightly more comfortable seating, which suggested it had been designed for a different standard of passenger than the transit cruiser. I found my seat by the window and put my bag in the compartment above, and sat down and looked out at the enormous structure of the Hegemony Central Station receding as the shuttle moved away from its dock. I opened my personal log. I sat for a while without writing anything, looking at the blank entry space and thinking about what I wanted to say, and what was true, and whether those were the same thing, and how to make them the same thing in words. Then I wrote. I did not write about the trade agreement, because the ministry would write about the trade agreement in documents that would be more complete and accurate than anything I could produce. I did not write about the formal diplomatic outcomes, because those would be documented by people whose job it was to document them. I wrote about what it felt like to be the kind of thing I was in a room full of things I was not. I wrote about Sella pressing her forehead to the back of my hand, and the specific quality of what that meant among the Mirai, and the fact that it was the second time in my life I had been given that gesture by a person from a species whose farewell tradition I had not expected to ever be relevant to me personally. I wrote about the Khitan archivist's question about the texture of the thing, about the fact that he had used exactly that word, texture, when he was trying to describe what the hegemony archives were missing about humanity, not the facts, the texture, the inside of it. I wrote about Velrith's nod, which I had been thinking about at various points over the preceding week, and which I was still thinking about. A Vreth officer, trained in the most rigorous tradition of a species that had never adopted the gestures of anything else, had deliberately learned and used a human gesture, in a context where it would be understood by the person it was directed at. That was not a small thing. That was a significant investment of attention and intention. It meant something about the direction Velrith was going, about what questions he was asking himself, about what the next 20 years of his career might produce. It was possible, I thought, that Velrith was going to be an interesting person to watch from a distance. I wrote about Ziltar's feathers going flat in the dining hall, and about the observation corridor, and about the thing I had seen in his eyes at the airlock. And then I wrote the thing I had been circling around since the first night on the Velshan, when I lay in my bunk and listened to the engine hum, and thought about what I was doing on this ship and what I was for. We were not the fastest seas in the hegemony. We were not the physically strongest. We were not the most technologically advanced. And we were not the most diplomatically experienced. And we did not have the longest history of interstellar relations, or the largest territory, or the most allies, or the most impressive military record, by the standard metrics of impressive military records. We were the species that had started as prey. We were the species that had looked at the arithmetic of its own survival and found the error in the arithmetic and exploited it, not once, repeatedly. Every time the numbers ran against us, and they ran against us more than once, we found the thing that the numbers had failed to account for, and we used it, and we were still here. Every human being alive carried the compressed weight of that entire process. Not as memory exactly, not as conscious knowledge that you could access deliberately, as something deeper than that, as the shape of what you were, formed over generations, encoded in the way you thought, and the way you faced things that tried to stop you, and the way you got back up when the first answer did not work, and tried another one. I carried that weight, heavier than most perhaps, because 40 years of additional compression had added to what was already there. But every human at every table in every room in the galaxy carried some version of it. Ziltar's biology had felt all of it in the shape of one old man standing quietly at a dining table. His biology had been correct, not because I was dangerous in any physical sense, not because I was powerful in any conventional sense, but because I was the visible product of the thing that humanity had made itself into over the long process of learning to survive. And that thing had a shape that ancient predator biology recognized at a level below conscious processing, the level where the original fear lived. The level where the species' memory of what made something genuinely worth being careful about was stored. The thing that made something genuinely worth being careful about was not size, not speed, not venom or armor or any physical attribute. It was the willingness to keep going after the situation had moved past the point where stopping would have made sense. We had never stopped, not as a species. We had come very close more than once, close enough that the probability calculations should have resolved against us. And every time, something in the human arrangement had found a way through that was not in the model. A cooperation that went wider than expected. A creativity that produced an answer that had not existed before. A refusal, buried in the architecture of what we were, to accept the outcome that the external analysis suggested. We were not a warrior species. We were not a predator species. We were not the biggest or the fastest or the most fearsome by any of the measures that species use to assess such things. We were the species that did not stop. And the hegemony, for the first time in 7 years of attempts, was beginning to understand what that meant in practice. The shuttle accelerated away from the station. Through the window, the hegemony's central cluster shrank toward the stars, becoming one bright point among many, and then smaller, and then indistinguishable from the general field. I thought about Aberdeen. about the specific quality of light on a gray morning, which was most mornings, and the smell of the air coming off the estuary, and the sound the pigeons made when they were impatient for their morning arrangement to begin. About Lena's face when I told her. I thought about Owen Harris, the way I thought about him periodically, not with guilt but with the particular weight of someone who had been there, and came back and carries the fact of that disproportion carefully. About the 7 others whose names I could recite in order without effort. About what they had given, and what I had learned from being there when they gave it, and what I had done with that learning over the 40 years since. About the chain. The unbroken chain of people who had survived difficult things and passed the knowledge of survival forward to the next generation, who had survived their own difficult things and passed it forward again. The chain that ran from the small frightened animal on the savannah 10,000 years ago, all the way to a retired sergeant major on a shuttleback, from the galactic hegemony summit with a signed trade agreement in his duffel bag. The chain had not broken. I was one link in it. Lena would be another, and the person after Lena, and the person after them, each one carrying the accumulated weight of every difficult thing that everyone before them had survived and passed forward, the archive growing longer and heavier and more comprehensive with every generation. Whatever the hegemony threw at humanity next, we would carry that archive into it. I opened the book I had been trying to finish 6 years, found my page, read 3 sentences, and fell asleep. The sleep was clean and deep and entirely without fear, the way sleep is when you have put down the thing you were carrying exactly where it needed to go. The stars moved outside the window, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small, stubborn species moving through the space between them. We had been moving through that space for a while now. We would keep moving. That was in the end what we were.